Hello, everybody else.
Hello, John.
How's it, Debbie?
Good, and you?
Good, thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay, we're now live on YouTube, so the whole world can see you. And I'm going to now share the screen. I'll mute everyone for the duration of the studying of the chapter, and then, as we've done in the past weeks, we can take a few more moments at the end for any questions or comments or discussion. Okay, so we got about 30 seconds to 1 o'clock, and I'll share the screen. We'll get started on time.
No.
Okay, just confirming that everyone can see that.
Yep. All good.
Great. Hold on, I'm gonna. Okay, as always, good to see you, to see everyone, and it's been quite a journey. We're now finishing another section of the halakha. This is the 12th chapter in the laws of avodat kochavim, which is idolatry, and this chapter 12 brings us to the end of this particular section. Tomorrow, very appropriately, we begin the laws of Teshuvah. I say appropriately because we are in the midst of the month of Elul, preparing for Rosh Hashanah, which is really all about Teshuvah, but more of that for tomorrow. Today's chapter is interesting because it includes laws that the Rambam has associated with idolatry. Other earlier codifiers and commentators take issue with the Rambam on this because they're not explicitly prohibited in the Torah as practices of worship per se. But the Rambam saw it generally as the way in which those who were involved in idolatry would behave, certain conduct that they had part of their life, and he sees it as part of these general prohibitions. It's the last 7 mitzvot of the 51 that he listed at the beginning of this section. What else, another interesting point in this particular chapter is that the Rambam uses this space to share with us some general rules about halakha, particularly with regard to which mitzvot are applicable to women and which not. So although these are certainly not the laws of idolatry per se, but he uses a springboard to present this general rule. So let's begin with the first halakha, and we'll see as we go through what are these practices. Rambam says, one may not shave the corners of one's head like the idolaters did, like the priests of idolatry. As the verse says, do not cut off the corners of your head. Here he's talking about what we would refer to as the peyot. Corners of your head is this area of the head, cutting that, and as we'll see soon, in the words of the Rambam, here we're talking about the type of cutting that destroys the hair, which means to shave it off with a razor. Cutting it with scissors, we'll see, is not the same problem. And the Rambam emphasized that there is a liability for each side of the head, even though it's one mitzvah. But if someone cut both sides of his head, even if it happened at one time, so either you took 2 razors and went like this, or you had somebody else, 2 people, one on this side and one on that side, and taking it off. If you were warned against doing this, you would be liable for lashes, which is the punishment that the Torah gives for transgressing a prohibition in the Torah. And this would be true whether or not you just cut off the sideburns or whether you shave your entire head, including the sideburns. Either way, taking off the sideburns, what we call the peyot, is a biblical prohibition if done with a razor, and if one was warned, then you would be liable for the punishment of lashes. The second halakha, now if a woman would shave off the sideburns of a man, or if she allowed herself to have her sideburns shaved off, petura. So she would be, sorry, I left out a line on the previous halakha. excuse me, let's go back a moment. The last line, he says, when does it apply that one would receive the liability and the punishment? The one that does the act of shaving. So if the person that shaves me, he's the one that's doing the prohibited act. He's the one that gets lashes. The person that's having their head shaved, the passive individual, although they are transgressing a prohibition, do not get the punishment, because as we've learned and as we'll see further, in order for one to be liable for the actual punishment, one has to do an act. So in that case, if he assists the barber, so you move your head while he's doing it, or you actually engage in some act that enables the shaving, then the person whose head is being shaved would also be liable. Now, as we began the second halakha, we'll move back to it. A woman who shaves the sideburns of a man, or if she has her sideburns shaved, is not liable. There's no Torah prohibition for the woman to do so. And the reason is, as the Rambam says, because the verse that prohibits cutting off, shaving the sideburns is the same verse that prohibits shaving the beard. As the verse says, do not round out the corners of your head, meaning don't cut off the sideburns, and do not destroy the facial hair. So we learn that only those who are liable for the mitzvah not to destroy the facial hair are also therefore prohibited against and liable for cutting the sideburns. The isha she'ena bal tashchis, and being that a woman does not grow a beard, if she'ena zaken, she doesn't have the prohibition, therefore the prohibition against cutting sideburns does not apply to her. So because she doesn't have the prohibition and would not be liable to have her own sideburns cut, she also would not be liable for punishment if she were the one shaving a man who is liable, because you would only get punishment for something that you yourself would be liable for. Now here's something that the Rambam inserts, which is kind of relates to a general rule with regard to obligations relating to mitzvot, an association of obligation, which is not specific to the laws of idolatry, but like I say, he uses this halacha to bring it to the fore. Lefikach, he says, therefore, avadim, slaves, slaves who do grow a beard, in other words, male slaves, they would be prohibited from cutting off their sideburns. Generally in halacha, there is an association between laws that a woman is obligated, mitzvot that a woman is obligated, and mitzvot for which a slave, and here we're talking about a Canaanite slave, would be obligated. A Canaanite slave, meaning someone that came to a Jewish owner from a non-Jewish family, they're not Jewish, they must take on a certain level of mitzvot. They have to convert really to Judaism, but the conversion is to a degree that there's certain limitations on the mitzvot that they're required to do. So we'll see in a moment what is the definition of those mitzvot that a woman is not required to do. And similarly, a man slave would also not be required to do those mitzvahs. The basic definition, as we'll see, is positive mitzvahs that are time bound. Because in the vision that the Torah has of raising, generating Jewish families and communities, the woman plays a critical role in raising her family. And that is something that often is beyond her control of time. We do not impose on her mitzvot that would insist that she does certain things at a certain time. She has to be available to do what's more important and critical, educating the children, maintaining a household that raises children who are God-fearing and focused and have that identity. Similarly, a slave, if they are required to do work for their master, and all of a sudden they come and say, I can't do work, I'm busy doing this and this mitzvah. So it would take away from the value of the master. So a slave would not be obligated in certain mitzvahs, positive mitzvahs that are time bound. Now, although there is that general association, the rule over here is the reason why the law of not cutting the sideburns does not apply to women is only because of its association with not shaving the beard. And that only does not apply to women, not because of her role, but because physiologically women generally don't grow a beard. So it would apply to a slave who does grow a beard, even though, as I said, generally has the same general obligations as a woman. Okay, we're going now to the third halacha, and here we've got this kind of framing of which mitzvah a woman is obligated and which one she's not obligated in. Any negative mitzvah, in other words, any don't in the Torah, both men and women are equally obligated, except with three exceptions. Bal tashchis, not to shave the beard. Bal takif, not to shave off the sideburns. Or val yitame kohen meitim. Kohanim, we know, have special laws with regard to coming into contact with a deceased body. And this would apply to male kohanim and not women kohanim. Chol mitzvahs aseh. What other mitzvahs would a woman not be obligated in? Any positive mitzvah. She's mizman lizman ve'ena tatira, which only one is obligated in from time to time, but is not a constant mitzvah. Nashim Turas, women are exempt from fulfilling those mitzvahs. Now, they can do it, and where possible, they will get a mitzvah for doing it, but they're exempt. They don't have the obligation. What are the mitzvahs that are considered, as we said earlier, time-bound positive mitzvahs? So it's mitzvahs that either come around occasionally, like lulav on Sukkot, or mitzvahs that are related to a certain time of day, like tefillin during the day. Tefillin we only put on during sunlight hours. So those are mitzvahs that a woman would not be obligated in, with the exceptions of Kiddush Hayom, making Kiddush and Shabbos. And the reason there is, and other similar mitzvahs, where this is like the flip side of a negative command, right? We said a woman is obligated in all negative commands. All the don'ts of Shabbat, don't do work, apply to a woman. So this mitzvah of saying Kiddush, which is the flip side of that mitzvah, a woman is obligated in. Similarly, similarly, for that reason, a woman is obligated to eat matzah on the night of Pesach, because it's associated with the prohibition against eating chametz. Similarly, the actual Paschal sacrifice. There's another mitzvah in the Torah, which is once in 7 years, the entire community would gather together in the temple. And there the Torah specifically mentions women. So therefore, even though it was a time-bound mitzvah, women would be obligated in that. V'simcha, as also the joyful expression on Yom Tov, is something that a woman is obligated in. Shanoshim chayavas, although those are the exceptions where a woman would be obligated. Now here we have an interesting category of individual. Tumtum androgynous. Tumtum and androgynous. What's a tumtum? A tumtum, the halacha describes as somebody who displays no obvious signs of gender. So their sexual organs somehow are covered over. So it's a doubt whether this individual is a man or a woman. Or androgynous is an androgynous person, somebody who actually has both female and male genitalia. So from a halachic point of view, we look at this person, harein safek. There's a doubt. How are they obligated in the eyes of halacha? Are they obligated as a man, or is they obligated as a woman? And therefore, the Rambam gives us, again, this is a general rule across all of halacha. They have to take on the stringencies that apply to a man and the stringency that apply to a woman in all areas. But if they transgress one of those prohibitions, they do not get lashes. In other words, they must take on the obligation as a man or a woman, but they would not be liable for punishment if they transgressed any of them. So in other words, the androgynous cannot cut off their sideburns, but if they did, they wouldn't be lashed like a man would be. The fifth halacha. Although a woman, as we said earlier, is allowed to shave off her sideburns, she is not allowed to shave that of a man. Although we said earlier she won't get punished for it, she's not allowed to do it. But that would apply even to a minor, a male child. She's not allowed to do it because that child eventually will become obligated in the mitzvah, so she's not allowed to do it. Many of you might be familiar with the custom of the opsherin, right? Opsherin is that it's customary that we allow a young boy to grow his hair until the age of 3, and then at 3 years old he gets his first haircut. But the intention is that we cut his hair in such a way that we're very particular to leave him sideburns. Of course, as you know, there are Hasidic groups where they never cut those sideburns at all. But we'll see here from the Rambam and many others that cutting it with scissors is not a problem. But cutting it completely off, we don't do. Even with a scissor, we leave a certain amount, which is we want to have from the kind of the temple area down to if you put your hands on the side of your head over here, you'll feel there's like a bone. We want the hair on the side to come over the bone. From there and down is considered the beard. And we'll see now there's particular restrictions in a moment to cutting the beard. So again, so let's just look at the halacha inside on halacha 6. Now, when we say you can't cut it off, what are we referring to? We say you have to leave there at least what he says here is 40 hairs. I don't know how you measure that exactly, but like I'm saying, in this area, you have to leave at least 40 hairs. He says over here, one is allowed to cut those payot, the sideburns, with scissors, as opposed to, as we say in the prohibition, which is to shave it off with a razor. Because as he says, it was only prohibited with removing it with a razor. And again, here it's by the association, what the Torah says with regard to the beard. The Torah uses the word hashchasa, tashchit, to destroy the beard, which we understand means to cut with a razor. Just as the prohibition for the beard, at least biblically, is to shave with a razor. Similarly, only the sideburns would be shaven with a razor would be that prohibition. And therefore, cutting with the scissors, so long as we leave something over, is okay. This is halacha 7. It was the ways and the custom of pagan priests to shave off their beards. Therefore, the Torah forbids us from shaving off the beard. This is a point of contention. Like we said, the Rambam associates this specifically with idolatry. Other early commentators say this is it's basically a standalone isur. It's prohibited in the Torah because that's what Hashem says. Now he says, but what does it mean when we talk about the facial hair or the beard? He says, there are 5 what we call corners of the face. Lechia elyon, the upper cheek, lechia tachton, the lower cheek, both on the right-hand side and the left-hand side, and then the chin area. Now, it's pointed out in the Shulchan Aruch later on that we're not exactly sure what's the upper cheek, what's the lower cheek. Some give a little bit more specification than the Rambam. Excuse me, but as a rule, the Shulchan Aruch says we're not so clear, so therefore we consider the whole face, all the facial hair on the face, part of this prohibition. And if someone were to shave it off with a razor, intentionally, with a warning, loika or kopea, one would be liable for lashes for each of these corners. In other words, 5 sets. Similarly, if he had everything shaved off at one time, so 5 people are working on his face, or somebody held 5 razors and was able to take it off at once, also in that instance, he would be liable for 5 sets of punishment. Now, but he explains that one is only liable when one does so shaves with a razor, because the expression in the Torah is lo tashchis et patzkanecha, you should not destroy the corners of your beard. And destroying is only done when it's done with a razor. Therefore, if somebody cuts with a scissor, you would not be liable for punishment. That's interesting. The phrase here that the Rambam uses is patur, you're not liable. As a rule, when we have this expression in halacha, patur, that you're not liable, usually it means that it's still considered prohibited. So it seems that according to the Rambam, even cutting one's beard with a scissors would be a prohibition. It would not be, you would not be biblically liable for punishment. Of course, we're very familiar that many people do shave. And I should just point out that shaving with a razor would be a problem. But many halachic authorities do allow for cutting with a scissors, or most electrical shavers which use a scissor action would be okay. But this is, I would suggest, somewhat of a simple mitzvah to avoid. Even for someone who does cut their beard, rather than using a razor, one should certainly try to find an electric shaver that uses a cutting action rather than, as the Torah describes it, destroying the corners of one's beard. Now, again, over here, we talk about the person that actually does the act of shaving is the one that's liable. So if you had a barber shave you, well, it's a transgression of the prohibition, but you wouldn't be held liable unless, as we said previously, like with cutting off the sideburns, unless you assisted him. So if you assisted by moving your head or whatever it might be, because as we explained, there must be an action associated with the prohibition in order for one to be liable for a punishment. A woman is allowed to, so we said earlier, she's not included in this prohibition. If a woman did, for whatever reason, grow facial hair, she would be allowed to shave it off. And if she did shave the face of a man, which she's not allowed to do, but if she did it, she would not be liable for punishment. Halacha 8. We've said that the facial hairs, one is not allowed to destroy, but one's mustache, one would be allowed to. And he explains what is the mustache. It's the hair above the lip. It's also the hair that grows just below the lip. Those are not included in the prohibition. Now he says, although it is permissible to cut and even shave the mustache or the hair on the lower lip. The general accepted practice is that we don't shave it, but one would perhaps cut it with the scissors just to ensure that the mustache doesn't get in the way of one's food and so on. Halacha tes. Here the Rambam now moves into the next one of the mitzvot, and this is related to the prohibition against, and as we'll see more explicitly in a moment, men adopting beautification kind of practices that are generally associated with women and vice versa. So he says, removing hair from other parts of the body. And yeah, he specifically refers to parts of the body that one does not see. So there wouldn't be biblical lashes for this, but there would still be a transgression of prohibition. He gives examples, like for example, the underarms or the genitalia area. The Torah does not prohibit this, but it is a rabbinic prohibition. And here we're talking about specifically for women, and someone who does remove their hair, again, shaves underarms or the genitalia area for a man, they would be liable for this rabbinic form of punishment of lashes. And here he says it's dependent on what the general practice is. If we're talking about that this is a practice that is specifically a process of beautification for women, then women obviously can do it. Men can't, because it's now adopting those processes which are specific for women, and that's where the issue lies. But if it's common practice of men and women do that, if you removed it, a person would not get even rabbinic lashes. And he says, other than those private areas, which generally he says maybe women only do and not men, and in that instance, men would be prohibited from doing it from a rabbinic perspective. Other hair on the body, one would be allowed to remove using scissors. Halacha 10. Lo ta'adeh isha adeish. A woman should not adorn herself with male adornments or jewelry or accessories. He gives an example. A woman should not wear a particular type of turban that men wore in those days, or a particular type of hats that were specifically worn by men. To wear armor. Armor is considered a man's garb, and women should not be wearing armor. She should also not cut her hair in what is considered a male type of haircut, and vice versa. Similarly, a man should not adorn female type jewelry or accessories. And he gives example. Like, for example, necklaces, bracelets, or colorful clothing, which were generally in those places worn specifically by women. A man should not wear these things. And he even emphasized everything with this regard follows the kind of the local custom, the custom of the place and the time. If a man does wear these things that a woman's clothing or a woman's accessories or jewelry, and a woman likewise does the opposite, both of them would be liable for lashes. Now here's an interesting one for men. He says a man who plucks out white hairs from his head or his beard, even if he plucks out just one, in other words, if your intention is to pluck it out for the purpose of beautification, this is a transgression of this particular mitzvah, that a man should not be doing beautification practices that are specifically associated with women. And one would be liable even for plucking out one hair if that was your intention. Similarly, dyeing one's hair with this intention, as soon as you begin to dye even one hair, you already have transgressed, and one would be liable for lokeh for those lashes. Tumtum androgynous, what about those individuals that we've described as the halacha finds them doubtful, because either they have both their organs display both genders, or it's unsure which gender it displays. So they should, that's difficult, right? So they shouldn't, he says, wear scarves generally like women do, but at the same time, they should not cut down their hair completely like men do. And if they did so, ain't a look, as we said earlier, but if they did any of these things that they shouldn't be doing, they would not be liable for punishment, because again, at the end of the day, the halachic status is doubtful. So we take on the stringencies, but you're not liable for the punishment. Halacha 11. Katovi kaki. Here we come to tattoos. The Torah forbids one from tattooing their skin. And that means cutting into the skin and filling that skin with ink. Sorry, let's bring it up to the page. Or some coloring that will remain there and leave an imprint. And the reason the Rambam says is because this was the ways of idolaters, that they would imprint on their skin. Basically, they would brand themselves according to their idolatry. And it was as if they were saying, look, I'm branded according to this idol. It was an expression of their devotion to their particular deity. And he says that at any time, if you make an incision, you fill it with ink on any part of your body, man or woman, this is prohibited, and one would be liable for lashes. What happens if you wrote on the skin, but it wasn't embedded into the skin, or you cut the skin, but you didn't fill it with ink? So in those instances, one is not liable for this particular transgression. It must be both things. Ketovet kaka means that it must be written into the skin so that it's actually ink that's injected below the surface and remains there as a permanent mark. Again, when is it? When you write on the skin, and as I said, that it's injected into the skin. Now, what happens? The person that's implementing that tattoo, they are the one that's liable. The one that's having a tattoo placed on them is not liable, but it's still, as we said earlier, is a transgression, unless they assist somehow in making sure that the process is eased. So it's the same principle as we've had before as well. Now we talk about another practice which was common to idolaters, and that was that people would self-mutilate as an expression of grief and mourning. So a Jew is not allowed to do this. One is not allowed to gouge your flesh in an expression of grief. And this would apply whether to a Kohen or to an Israelite. And the reason why the Rambam mentions that is because we have this verse twice, once as a general teaching, and then we have it also as a teaching specifically for the Kohanim. And he says, therefore, it's actually the same prohibition that applies both to an Israelite and to a Kohen. And he says like this: if somebody cuts themselves once for 5 people, or 5 times for one person, in both those instances, you would be liable for each of the 5 and would be lashed accordingly. And that, but again, he reminds us that's particularly if there was a warning for each of them, because one only gets punished if they were warned before doing that. Halacha 13. So Gedido Srita Achasi, he says now, gashing one's skin, the difference over here is either when one does it by hand, or if you mutilate yourself with an object. He says basically, for the purpose of this mitzvah, it would be the same thing, because we find that's pagan practice was that they would gouge themselves mutilate themselves in this expression. But now they would also mutilate themselves sometimes as an expression of worship to an idol. So here the Rambam clarifies that one is generally not allowed to mutilate themselves, whether with their hand or with an object. However, when you do so as a sign of grief, this is the particular prohibition that we're speaking about over here, and that's when one would get lashes. But if you did it just as an expression of worship, obviously that's not allowed, but that's not this specific prohibition. One would not be lashed for that, even though it's prohibited. Halacha 14. Now here's a very fascinating halacha in the Rambam. You see the word in Hebrew, I'll highlight for a second, that says that you should not gouge yourself or mutilate oneself, is lo titgodedu. Now, that word could have just as easily been written lo titgodu, without that extra Hebrew letter dalet over there. Now, with that extra letter dalet, it lends itself to further interpretation. And this word has an additional meaning. Other than meaning to gouge oneself or mutilate oneself, it means to create groups. And the Rambam learns from here, and it's accepted also in halacha, that this prohibition also includes not creating separate groupings within a community. Now, this gets a little bit complicated how it's in practice today, but he says like this: this command includes the prohibition against there being 2 courts which follow different customs in one city. A city should have one Jewish authority which everybody follows, because otherwise you are going against this prohibition, lo titgodedu, which he translates as lo tasu agudot, do not make various and different groupings. In practice, we allow within a congregation to follow its customs. Most of the authorities see it only as problematic if within the court you have dissenting views, and that you shouldn't have But if you have different communities, for example, Sephardim and Ashkenazim, it's quite acceptable that they follow their own type of customs, even if they're in the same city. And even different shuls within the Ashkenazi milieu or the Sephardim milieu, if they have their own particular traditions from their own families or their own place of origin, that would be perfectly acceptable. So the final two halachot, halacha 15, we might go slightly over half an hour here, but we're almost done. This is a practice where people would pull out their hair in mourning. So here the Torah forbids, we'll keep it brief. One is not allowed to create bald spots on their head. That means pulling out what amounts to be 36 hairs as a sign of mourning. One, you can't do this, the Rambam says, not by pulling the hair out and not by applying some type of chemical that would remove that hair. Creating those bald spots is a prohibition, and for each spot that one does it, one would be liable. He says, so for example, even if you took your fingers, I guess if you had a bit of chemical on each finger and you put it on your head at one time in 5 individual spots, burnt out the hair, you would be liable for each one. Halacha 16, the final halacha. Now he says these practices of gashing oneself, pulling out one's hair, which the prohibition that we're talking about here is specifically when it's done as a sign of grief. And for that one would be liable for this prohibition and therefore subject to the punishment of lashes. If someone does these expressions of grief over material loss, because his house broke down or he lost a ship at sea, then it's something one is not allowed to do, but one would not be liable for this particular Avera. Now, so he concludes that the following law applies when a person creates a bald spot on a colleague's head, makes a gash on a colleague's flesh, or tattoos his colleague's flesh while his colleagues assist him. Again, he's emphasizing that the one that does the act is the one that is liable. If both of them intended to violate the prohibition, then both of them will receive lashes. They both are liable. If one violated the prohibition inadvertently, and one did so intentionally, so you didn't know that what was happening was a prohibition, but somebody came along and shaved you off, then the one who did so intentionally is liable. The one who did so unintentionally or without knowing is not. And that brings us to the conclusion of this chapter. And as we mentioned, this concludes also this section of Halakha, and tomorrow begins a new section of Teshuvah. Okay, I'm going to end the live stream.